My name is Joanna Rosado, and I'm a public school teacher. I've been a public school teacher for 23 years, and the majority of my experience has been in alternative education. And that was me finding my educational home, and something that I actually didn't even know existed until I was invited to do that work. And I was invited to do that work based on my relationships with students and my ability to connect with families. Where I started out, I actually had been a student. So my first job was at the high school that I attended. And so I was really familiar with everybody. And that was actually a cool way to start out teaching, because starting out teaching is hard enough. And so I did it in a place where I was familiar with the building and I was familiar with the staff. So sometimes they'll even talk about like residency models, and it almost seemed like that because, like I said, all those other factors were not new to me. Like I knew where I was going and I knew who I was talking to, and I had had good relationships with my teachers and things like that. And so after my first year, I was invited to be part of a new alternative education program. And it was something that was unique, where it was a partnership between the school district and like the juvenile justice system. And so they provided me a lot of professional development opportunities and also opportunities to work with the actual juvenile justice, the county workers. So I got to see a side of I guess, care and services for kids that I wouldn't have seen if I was just limited to the school. And so right away, like I said, I knew that this was a niche for me, and mainly because the focus of alternative education is really sharing who you are. And it's really about developing your own awareness and using your awareness and your life experiences to be able to connect with and share with students. So that was something that just felt really good to me and came to me very naturally. And so over the course of my career, I have continued to just stick with and love alternative education and get into different models of how can we engage students who our system deems as disengaged from the school system. Over the course of my career, I have designed and implemented several different alternative education programs. Starting out with classic like school within a school model, moving into more standardized with an academic focus model, moving into online learning, and then back again to more of a community school well-being model. Some of my most exciting work has been the recent development of a program called the Real Academy. And I started to develop the Real Academy 17 years ago. And it took 10 years to have it come to life because other things got in the way in terms of budgets and priorities in schools. But after 10 years of appealing to the school district again and again, the program was approved, and we've been operating for 7 years. And the Real Academy is a unique model. It uses student well-being as the tool that we teach through. So often in alternative education, or when we're looking at meeting needs for students, we often look at their social emotional needs like on the side. And we'll say like, okay, they're in school, but we're going to support maybe what they're going through developmentally or emotionally on the side. So in our program, we actually use those issues as the things to teach through. So for example, something that I've developed to help kids look inward are called the productive worker traits. And the productive worker traits are a series of traits that on the outside sound like, hey, I'm learning how to do this job in this classroom. But they're designed to help students look inward and be able to regulate themselves. The first productive worker trait is attendance and punctuality. Of course, we want you to be here and we want you to be on time. But the inward trait of attendance and punctuality is really, it's about habit forming. What habits do you have in place in order to be there and be on time? Who are you depending on, and who are you really doing the job of school for? A second productive worker trait is organization, which on the outside is the whole Do you have what you need for class every day? Do you have your pens? Do you have your notebooks? Are you wearing the appropriate attire for a gym class? But really the inward trait of organization is it's all about planning. What routines do you have in place in order to be balanced mentally and physically? Because when you're balanced mentally and physically and you have those routines in place, you'll remember those things. The third productive worker trait on the outside is task completion. Are you actually getting your work done? Are you doing things on the outside? The very external things are the things in the grade book, are the things in your notebook. But the internal view of that is your view, and who are you doing this work for? When you look at it as I'm doing it so that my teacher can put down a grade, or I'm doing it so that my mom will get off my back, those are all external things, and they're actually not very motivating, especially to adolescents. So when we can teach them to look inward and say, this is really about, task completion is about your view. Who are you doing this work for? You're really doing it for yourself. So the first three productive worker traits, the attendance and punctuality, organization, and task completion, are very external things. And they're things that students can actually see from the outside. They're aware of their attendance and when I was there or when I was late. They're aware of if they have the supplies they need. They're aware of are they getting things done or not. The last four productive worker traits are really helping us to get even more internal because they focus on things that aren't as easy to see from the outside. The fourth productive worker trait on the outside is enthusiasm. So the nonverbals kind of let us know where kids are at and what they're doing, and we'll say like, doesn't look like you're very involved or that you're very excited about this. Again, that external cue and that external pleasing. But we want to help kids be able to look on the inside. And so the external is enthusiasm, but the internal trait that we teach with that is actually your mindset. Are you aware of how you choose to feel? And are you aware of what you're offering to others in your community? The fifth productive worker trait is taking initiative. On the outside, does it look like you're self-starting and getting to work on your own? But the internal trait that aligns with taking initiative is actually about opportunities. Are you able to be open to new experiences and new opportunities? The sixth productive worker trait is self-esteem. That's our external word for it. Our internal word would be respect. How do you treat yourself and others? And are you open to hearing differing viewpoints? And the seventh productive worker trait is called self-management, and that's the whole picture. Can you handle your business inside and outside of school? And so on the outside, we call that self-management. That's our external word for it. But the internal behavior that aligns with that is responsibility. Some of the most natural examples I can give is about students and their sleep schedules. And so when we talk about our sleep schedules, a lot of times kids think like, that is out of school. Like, why do you care when I'm going to bed? And yet this is something that I always will talk with them about because it does really impact all of those productive worker traits. But when students start to develop an awareness that their organizational, their routines the night before school impact their next day, that's a really good example of how students can bridge that gap. And we really will talk about like, what do you do before you go to bed? How do you make sure that you get to sleep? We also will talk about when students have issues with getting to school at all or on time. Again, we'll really talk about those organizational routines. I'll take them through having them tell me like, how do you wake up? Who wakes you up? What parts are you responsible for? And again, always the look inward. I am dealing with adolescents, so it's not out of the question to say that if you're 15, 16, 17, 18, that you can be getting yourself out of bed and that you should be taking that on for yourself. So I think about habits with attendance and punctuality. Those are some of the first things that students start to see inward when they start to realize that maybe some of the issues they were having with getting to school or getting on time is because they were depending on other unreliable people, and that once they decide that they're going to be in charge of that, when they look inward and realize that they can do that for themselves, attendance can clear up. It's also not uncommon for students in alternative education one of the lagging skills is to not be able to think about a broad range of solutions. And so when I can really work with kids and talk with them about what are all the different solutions that we could look at for how you get here, how you get on time, how you come in a mental space to be able to take on learning for the day, that's a good example too. Again, when you give students choice, when they are struggling with work, the whole task completion, the whole who are you doing it for, is reminding them that they're really doing it for themselves. And so if they don't like the way that I'm suggesting to go about something, let's talk about it and make it work for you. The external would be to just blame me, the teacher, and say, it's not working because you didn't explain it this way, or you did this wrong. The internal is to say, to work together and be like, well, how would it make more sense? How would you like it? Well, the productive worker traits can benefit the student inside of school and outside of school. It benefits them in their work in the classroom. It helps them with their own families. It helps them in their jobs outside of school as well. A lot of my students actually end up helping their families using these productive worker traits. They're teaching, let's say, their older brothers and sisters, their younger brothers and sisters, their moms, their dads. They're talking about these traits and these habits and recognizing or helping everybody to kind of look inward so that the family operates a little bit more smoothly. I literally have a lot of students who their own parents are suffering, and so it may be mom saying, it's too cold out, I'm not driving anybody today. And so my students get this inward burst of being like, but if I really want to go, then I've got to make this happen. I've either got to be able to express to mom that this is really important to me, so please bring me, or I've got to gear up and head out the door on my own and get to do what's important to me. In terms of me being in alternative education, my whole environment is set up for regulation. I always talk about the goal is regulation. There are so many things that are in the external setup of my classroom that lead to almost the full elimination of panic attacks. It is very rare that it occurs in our space because we are so mindful of the setup. We make everything very predictable for the students. The structures and routines are heavily in place. But then they do also have their own tools and knowledge from the lessons that we present about what is actually happening to me right now. Stress gives us a really physical response. So our heart really isn't going to beat out of our chest. We're really not going to stop breathing in this moment. I will get kids connected, honestly, with their breath and kind of coach them through and guide them through that it's this moment and that those are really thoughts that are challenging them and that we can choose to change those thoughts. Like the productive worker traits are really like I said, the standards, but then there is a whole different design of the day. And these are things that I encourage all teachers to be mindful of. A traditional education space is actually kind of stress-inducing. It's noisy, it's chaotic. And so the things that we can do to put in place, making it less chaotic and more calm are great. I find what works for me is, again, the daily greeting with students and literally checking in with them. I use binaural beats and literally kind of like the background music that I use. My seating, everything is always done in circles so that we are all equitable and able to be seen and able to be heard. Even our language is calming. We talk to each other using kind of regulated tones. And when somebody does get dysregulated, when somebody is elevated, we've taught and helped the kids to be able to deeply relate and empathize that we don't contribute to that. We kind of go the opposite direction and we say, oh my gosh, that's somebody who's communicating their suffering right now. How can we back off? How can we give them what they need? That's very different than what happens in a traditional space where you're kind of, as a teacher, you're kind of taught to be like, stop this behavior right now. You know, you get this out of here. And our method is more to let people kind of move through it. The emotion has to be moved through in order for it to dissipate. And students really can learn that empathy, and they're happy and willing to do that for each other. Because we will all say things like, when I'm having my bad time, that's how I want people to treat me. So much of my work is about responding and not reacting. We're taught to react in schools, that if this happens, then do this, instead of respond, take it in, think, connect with yourself. I think this can be applicable at any level and in any setting. Because again, if you go back to trying to understand who you are as a teacher, the more that you become aware of and can offer your students in terms of these supports, yeah, use it however you want to fit your classroom and your setting. Sometimes teachers don't think that they have the capabilities or the strengths or the skills in order to help students with intensive needs. And I believe that they do. I believe that when teachers develop awareness in themselves, when you become aware of your own emotional needs, when you become aware of your own habits, when you understand how stress works in your life, then you're able to help your students. And so when you have your own awareness, then you really have choice in how you're going to meet the needs of your students. Our systems are set up to be like, if this child is hurting or struggling, let's call someone in. And a lot of times those processes take some time. And so we all need to be able to do things where we can meet students' needs immediately. And so the more work that we do on our own emotional selves, that helps. And so something I really like to share with people is it kind of comes down to 3 core beliefs. So similar to how we are all born with a hair color and an eye color that we don't choose. It's just, this is how we come. We also come into the world with one of 3 core beliefs. And these core beliefs kind of drive all stress. And the first core belief is, I'm not good enough. And so when you feel that you're not good enough, and again, it's not even a feeling, it's just what's there. So if you can think about your own self and when you get stressed, if it goes back to one of these 3 things, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy enough, or I'm not safe. And so when we have issues with our students, it is usually tapping into one of those things in ourselves. That whatever is happening with the student, with the parent, it's tapping into our, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy enough, or I'm not safe. Mine happens to be, I'm not safe. And so that will come with like issues of trust. And so I realize that when I analyze things of how I'm reacting to students and parents, I just can trace it back to that it's hitting that trigger of mine. And so just understanding that it's nothing that you're going to fix in yourself or that you should try to get away from. It's a thing to know and notice. And so as of teachers, if we understand what is our core belief that kind of drives our stress, then that really can help how we interact with and relate to our students. Another thing is, I really do like to share with people just the science of stress and understanding that similar to a core belief, we all have a different stress response. And typically there's 3 stress responses. There's fight, flight, and freeze mute. And so knowing what your own stress response is as an educator is also important, because when you get stressed, you're going into one of those modes. You're either fight, you're either flight, or you're freeze. Fight could look like escalating in a way with language. Flight could be like you just want to leave the situation, and freeze would be like you don't know what to say. And I have some examples of, there's like the worst of the worst example is I literally can think of when a fight broke out in my room. And I team teach, I work with another educator. And when this fight broke out, we were able to go back and reflect and see truly what our stress responses were. Mine was fight. I went right into it and tried to break it up. my colleagues was flight. She literally ran in the other direction. And so knowing that about ourselves can help us when we're trying to regulate ourselves and decide what to do for our children. And recognizing again that doesn't mean that has to be totally uncontrolled. It's like what I said earlier, that once you become aware, then you have a choice. When you become aware of how you're going to react or how you're getting triggered, then you have a choice in how you're going to relate and empathize with a student. I also like to talk about that when we are working with students, it's really important to keep their developmental needs in mind, or even just where they're at. A lot of school is focused on content, and we have to get back to focusing on the child. So something in my work in particular, I've always worked at the high school level. So over my 23 years, it's been all at the high school level. So I feel that I'm skilled in dealing with adolescents. And adolescence is a really amazing period of growth for humans. And unfortunately in our society, teens get a bad rap. And we talk about, some people will say like, oh my God, I'm glad I'm not a teenager. I'm so happy that part of my life is over. And there's a lot of it that characteristically we talk about very negatively. And actually, adolescence is this really beautiful time of growth in the human life. In fact, there's no other period of growth other than the first year where you grow so much in such a short amount of time. And so our adolescents are really growing in terms of what their minds can take on, and also then just their bodies and their physical and relational and all kinds of things. And so I always like to remind people to think about just adolescent development and where kids are coming from. And some of that has to do with the ability to choose. We always benefit when we actually give adolescents high levels of trust. But unfortunately, a lot of our structures are not set up that way. Like you have to ask to go to the bathroom. You have to ask if you can chew gum. I find kids asking like what color ink they have to use. And these are things that kind of are counter to what would really help with assisting adolescent development. Adolescents thrive with high levels of trust. And so when we can create environments where we give high levels of trust to students, they typically will thrive. Even your students who you might think can't handle it, try it and you'll see that when we give high levels of trust to our students, they usually can thrive. We actually don't live in the same time zone as our students. School is filled with talking about the future. We really start talking about the future. Well, we talk about it all the time. It's always like, you're going to use this someday, or what are you going to do in the future? And children have the gift of being present. They're in the now. So it's almost as adults to remember that. As adults, we actually probably spend a lot of our time hanging out in the past or worrying about the future. And the gift of children is that they are in the present moment. And the more that we can align and deliver things to them in the present moment and to their present self, the better off we'll be. In terms of it's literally how their brain works too. So a lot of adult frustration comes from children maybe making impulsive decisions and thinking like, what are they thinking? Well, they were thinking about that moment. That actually was what they were thinking. They weren't thinking about how this might ruin their college application 6 years from now. So another piece of advice would be get in the same time zone as your students. Another focus that I would recommend for teachers, and that we do in alternative education, is train yourself to look inward instead of outward. A lot of our work as teachers is actually, we're encouraged to look at the outward. We're supposed to look at the outline, we're supposed to look at the grade, we're supposed to look at everything that's very outward. But the more that we can train ourselves to look inward, the easier that will be to do. And so again, when we talk about working with students who we think might be hard to reach, or who we can clearly see are struggling, when we can look inward to ourselves, that'll help more than looking outward.